Well, as people continue to sign on, we want to make sure that we have as much time as we can for this great discussion we're going to have this morning. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Georgia Legislative Policy Forum. I'm Kyle Wingfield. I'm the president and CEO of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, and on behalf of our entire staff and our board of trustees, we're very glad you joined us this morning. This is the third event of our revamped forum. Like so much in our society, we've had to adapt to the current circumstances. In fact, that's the theme for this year's event, Wisdom, Justice, Adaptation. As you probably know, that's a play off the state's motto, and we believe adaptation is the right focus for this year's sessions. If you missed the first two events about education, including our opening keynote with U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, you can find recordings of those on our YouTube channel, Georgia Policy. And after today's panel, we'll be back here the next 4 Tuesdays at 11 a.m. to explore the ways Georgians, their families, their businesses, and their government are adapting to a changed world. We'll cover land use and transportation next week, and then the economy, housing, and healthcare. We have exciting panels of experts lined up for each of those, and we hope you'll be able to join us for as many of those as you're able. We're grateful to be joined on this journey by some key sponsors, without which our work would not be possible. They are our presenting sponsor, AT&T, our platinum sponsors, Verizon and the Walton Family Foundation, and our silver sponsor, the Georgia Association of Realtors. We thank each of them for their support of this event. Whereas tickets for our all-day Georgia Legislative Policy Forum in the past have typically cost about $100, we're pleased to be able to offer this year's outstanding lineup of speakers to you at no charge. We would appreciate your voluntary support of our work, of course, as we're completely privately funded as an organization, and you can visit georgiapolicy.org/donate to make a tax-deductible contribution. During this morning's program and the ones that follow, we'd like to hear questions from you in the audience, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. You can type those either in the chat or the Q&A box on your screen, and we will field those, and like I said, we'll get to as many of them as possible. But we have a great panel lined up to discuss budget matters, but first it's my great honor to welcome our opening speaker today, and that is Congressman Tom Graves. We're grateful that he's able to join us this morning to give a brief overview of how Congress has responded to the pandemic with several emergency bills and how he and his colleagues intended those appropriations to affect state and local governments and what we in the states can expect next. So Congressman Graves, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. Thanks, Kyle and Chris for hosting this, and Benita, it was great to spend a little time with you this morning also, and got a great panel lined up. And look, I know how difficult it is right now for everybody to operate in this sort of new norm, this environment of remote operations. So I'm grateful that you've continued the good work with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation to continue advocating and searching and sharing policy solutions and ideas. And you've been a great help to me over the many years. As I'm wrapping up now my public service this year after 18 and a half years between Georgia General Assembly and now in Congress. So what an interesting time to be wrapping it up. And I know it's a challenging time for everyone. In fact, here just in a few minutes, I'll be in our Rules Committee as the Republican leader of the Financial Services Subcommittee and Appropriations as we begin moving appropriations through the House. We did a little bit last week, and we'll continue this over the next week or two to try to meet our expectations or the expected deadline of September 30th, which is coming up of our fiscal year. But a lot of challenges clearly over the last 4 and 5 months. This is something that none of us could have predicted or foreseen. And I know it's challenging for the state, particularly, and I appreciate the senator being on here because the perspective of a balanced budget environment and trying to manage these challenges we have versus the non-balanced budget environment that we operate in. I greatly appreciate that because we've seen trillions of dollars so far moved very quickly from the federal government side. That I think the big question later, I mean, clearly some of it's needed and assistance needs to be provided and we need to help guide the country through this time. But the challenge later is going to be, how do you pay for it? And there's only a few ways in which you can raise revenue, and none of those are easy in the days ahead. So the next Congresses are going to have some challenges, some big challenges once we move through this pandemic, and we will. We'll get through it. We've been through a lot of challenges in our history. But what we've seen over the last several months is what is the right way to address it. And I guess we can be thankful we're in a divided government right now, because that helps moderate, in essence, the reactions and the responses. And we all have our political preferences and affiliations, but at the end of the day, when you're going through great challenges like this, you have to have some balance. And so we've seen that so far, and now we're about to experience the next phase of how do we address this. And in fact, you saw the Senate release their package yesterday or late last night, which is the balance to what the Democrats passed out of the House about a month ago. And so two very different concepts of how do you look at addressing some of these challenges. And so blending those together over the next couple of days is going to be a feat. It'll get done, I'm sure of that, but how does it get done and who does it assist will be the questions that we're all seeking in the end. I know, having a state perspective here, a lot of questions about, do we provide assistance to the states, to local governments? And that's been a large debated issue within Congress. And there has been some assistance moved through the states through, I guess it would be, Housing and Urban Development, through the USDA and some other vehicles, but there's not been a so-called state bailout or a local government bailout. And I think rightfully so. Everybody has to sort of manage through this together. But the key components, I think, of what you'll see as a continuation will be, can you build upon the payment protection plan that was originally passed? And that's in essence a modified unemployment mechanism, and it's keeping people in place in their position of work and productive while maintaining their pay, and allowing businesses to receive assistance from the federal government to maintain that over a period of time, and with a forgiveness of a loan, so to speak. And the next component has been the unemployment side, bolstering unemployment benefits for those that ultimately do lose their position or their work or from their place of employment, and providing that assistance to the state. So they're going to see some modifications to that, most likely. You've seen some other grant programs. You've seen some, I think you've seen some tax assistance, some various credits and such. And so as we go into the next phase of it, the question is going to be, what do you continue? What do you modify a little bit? What do you improve? What do you take from what you've learned over the last couple of months? And what did you miss? And certainly we hear from a lot of industry sectors who are greatly impacted, from the hospitality industry, the tourism industries, the local chambers of commerce, I guess the restaurant industry, so many other industries. And how do you sort of work within the framework we have, our tax code and other things, and try to do things in a responsible, balanced, measured way that ultimately doesn't drive us into a difficult deficit in the days ahead. So a lot of challenges, but as I'll sort of wrap up here, because I know there may be some questions, but for me, I've been on the Appropriations Committee. It's the only committee I've ever been on since I've been in Congress. And I never thought I'd be there, Kyle. I mean, that, my fiscal conservatism in nature. In fact, I was put on it to sort of disrupt the system in which we were able to do in our majority when we had it, and limit spending. So it pains me to see a lot of the increase in spending that we have now, but I understand some of the importance of it and assisting families and businesses through this difficult day. Something it was not their fault, is not brought on by anything they've done. It's just a pandemic that's our nation's struggling with at this time. But appreciate the good work you're doing with the foundation, the continuation of it, and you're probably going to be needed more than ever in the days ahead as the state of Georgia struggles with some of the policy challenges. So, but thanks again.
No, thank you for that, and great overview of where what we're going through and what we're trying to do here. One question that I had for you is, you talked about the differences between the two approaches, the House Democrats bill and the Senate Republicans bill. And one of the big differences is this Senate Republican bill does not send additional money to state and local governments, but it does do something in that it gives them flexibility in how to spend some of the money that's already been appropriated, especially via the CARES Act. Tell us a little bit, is that a good thing in your mind? Does that kind of strike the appropriate balance? How do you view that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the advantages of going through a period like this is you can look at what are creative ways to, one, create flexibility. So there's currently funding allocated in certain areas. So how can you create some flexibility so that funding the states, and in my opinion, should be making more of these decisions and should have more flexibility and less restrictions from the federal government. But how can you give them some of that leeway to touch the areas that are most important for their region or their state or their industries or their economy? In fact, what you'll see is some education funding. That's another area where we can assist the states. There's a lot of discussion about who goes back, where can they go? Will it be online? Will it be in person? I'm of the belief this is a great opportunity to highlight, school choice options, right? I mean, if a school is not going to offer an in-person instruction, but a family feels their child or their students deserve in person and they can go somewhere else, it's a good opportunity to be able to allow that flexibility to go where your student or your child can be best educated and their needs best met from an educational perspective. So hopefully you'll see some flexibility like that highlights probably a lot of policies you've worked on in the past, but necessity creates that opportunity now.
And very interestingly, we saw quite organically last week a protest outside the Gwinnett County school district offices, and there were parents with banners saying, open the schools or give us vouchers, which did not think I would see in a very sort of grassroots organic way like that. So it is interesting what we're seeing from people. We do have a question here from an attendee. It says, I read this morning in the National Review that the pandemic had forced the government to borrow $1 trillion per month between April and June, and that the national debt held by the public is expected to reach a staggering $41 trillion by 2030. The article went on to say that our present national debt is set to continue rising steeply for decades because Social Security and Medicare face a 30-year cash shortfall of more than $100 trillion. So the question after that preamble is, who is going to lend the government this money, and what is the answer? And I know that debt and spending, as you mentioned, but it's been a consistent theme for you during your career. So how do you think about that question?
I think once we move past this pandemic, I think it's going to be one of the greatest challenges that we have to deal with over time. And to those whom are elected next in the next Congress and beyond, it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, we're in the high 20 trillions of national debt prior to the pandemic, prior to the economic slowdown, and as well as this tremendous spending. We're looking at $3.5–4 trillion of new spending, which is equivalent to what an annual spending of our national government is with all national defense and everything else in any given year. So to see our national spending double from a discretionary perspective, I guess, for the most part, and including some of the other mandatory spending, to see that double within a couple of months, that's alarming. It really is. And so you ask the question, how do you pay that back? One, you have to borrow it, obviously, or in the meantime, you're doing some creative financing, obviously, is what's happening. But at some point, you have to pay it back. And there's only a few mechanisms to do that with, and that's you have to increase revenue. And the easiest place that elected officials like to go is to raise taxes. And that's rather than reduce restrictions and regulations on industry to see a flourishing economy, it seems to be easier to take rather than promote and see productivity. So my hope is that that's not what happens in the future, that there's not high taxation. But I've seen the tendency of this place to sort of track in that direction.
Forgot to unmute myself. Sorry. Question here, and I know you got to go, so we'll make this the last one. And this is, specific to the new package, I don't know if you've been through all the details yet, but this is a little bit more of a philosophical question, I think. Does the new package will the new package again send $1,200 checks to people who have not lost jobs or are already receiving government checks from various programs like the last package? And what is the point of sending money to people whose incomes weren't disrupted? Where do you think Congress has the ability to maneuver on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen the specifics, and what the Senate released yesterday is sort of the starting point. And so whatever you might see or read in it right now will probably be the floor. It'll be the most conservative relief package that will come through the process and get signed by the president. And my understanding is it has a $1,200 per person individual or $2,400 per family or couple check being mailed or deposited into accounts, and it's adjusted based on income and other things. But they seem to have a mechanism in place that allowed for that to occur in the past, and I don't know if they're going to make adjustments to that or not, but we'll see as the process goes through. But there's still some other things that were missing. The business liability component was missing from the Senate package, and I think that's really important. I think business and government liability protection is a vitally important piece of what needs to come through the next package. And I think some tax breaks should be a part of it as well. I think there's ways you can use the tax code in a positive way to incent more productivity or to incentivize hiring. And for those that are offered their job back but choose not to take it because they enjoy unemployment benefits, that should not be allowable. I think there should be a way in which employers can report to the federal government, because ultimately the employer is paying unemployment tax. It's an expense to the company over time. There should be a way for them to notify the federal government of employees that are being offered their jobs back and such, so a way to positively incentivize going back to work. So the economy is beginning to move in the right direction. We have to encourage it to do that. And Kyle, I'll sort of close with this, because I think one thing that has been highlighted through all this new remote work is the cyber vulnerabilities. You may have experienced it, but I know so many other companies are seeing their workforces displaced across the country and working on unsecure networks and working in different environments that they weren't familiar with, or they may not have the cyber specialists in place and such. And as I was wrapping up appropriations this year, that's really been the theme of this year for me, is continued cyber protection, pushing back on China, pushing back on companies that are owned by state-operated enterprises and such in China that are spying and gathering information on American citizens and such, and expanding the 5G or having a 5G plan, national plan for our country, because I think a lot of what we experience today is going to continue as far as how we operate, and so we need to have a strong, secure, and an available, reliable network in which people can operate on. So that has been another identifiable area that we need to work on as a country as well. But you guys are great. Thanks again for all your work over the years, and look forward to staying in touch in the days ahead.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those almost 2 decades of public service you referred to there, and we thank you for that, and I wish you all the best of luck in the future, and thank you specifically again for being with us this morning. So.
You bet.
Thanks very much, Congressman. All right. So I'll now turn things over to our moderator for this morning's panel, Chris Denson. Chris joined the Georgia Public Policy Foundation in March as our Director of Policy and Research. And with everything going on, he's obviously been quite busy. So before Chris gets going, let me remind everyone that you can find a link to our program with our panelists' full bios on our homepage, georgiapolicy.org. And with that, Chris, take it away.
All right, thank you, Kyle. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of our program this morning, I'd like to go around the horn and introduce everyone briefly. You'll find their full bios in the program that was attached to this year's policy forum. But you might notice we are missing one panelist this morning. Amy Cooke, who was slated to join us, is the CEO of the John Locke Foundation and the publisher of the Carolina Journal. She is currently experiencing technical difficulties, so we are working rapidly to resolve those and hope that she'll be able to join us. But in case she's not, then myself and our two panelists will do our best to provide a stimulating conversation in her absence. So we have State Senator Blake Tillery, who is the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, on our call this morning. And then we have Ben Scafidi, who is a professor with Kennesaw State and is the director of their Education Economics Center, and is also a senior fellow with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. So with that, I had promised Chairman Tillery he would get the opportunity this morning to kick us off and provide a brief overview of our state finances, much in the same way that Congressman Graves did with our federal approach. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chairman Tillery.
Thanks, Chris and Kyle and Benita. Thank y'all for allowing me to be on this program today, and thank you for hosting this. And again, trying to do things that are a little outside the box, given current environments. Ben, look forward to hearing from you later on, and have enjoyed hearing what you said already earlier this week. And hope Amy's able to make it on soon. Just going to give you a 25,000 foot view of kind of where the Georgia budget was coming into this year, and then maybe that's a good jump start for the rest of the things we're going to talk about. As you probably already have a pretty good idea about, Georgia's general fund is roughly about $25 billion. When we rolled into March, I think it would be a little presumptive to say that we were doing great. We already were having a little bit of issue making revenues. We kind of wondered last year whether or not we were going to make it all the way. That's not because of any coronavirus then. It's just we were noticing a little bit of a slowdown already. And we weren't hitting our numbers completely. We were rolling right in and just barely exceeding what we thought we were going to have for each fiscal year for the past two. So when you added to that what happened in March, it really did hit a quick slowdown fast, very fast. You saw in March that we realized that was going to be a problem. April, the end of April, I think the 1st of May was actually the date of the notorious memorandum from me, from Chairman England, and from the OPB director saying, hey, we're going to need to ask all agencies to be prepared, tell us what it would take to have a reduction of roughly 14% in your current funds. What would that look like? What would you cut? And how would you continue to still provide services necessary to Georgians? And to their credit, the agencies came back with reports of how they would do that. Now, some of them seemed a little more drastic than others. Some agencies are bigger than others. When you get into our people-heavy human services agencies, public safety agencies, et cetera, you're not able to cut enough paper clips to reduce a 14%, have a 14% reduction in your budget. What was miraculous, and I'll say divine about this, if there is any good, is that Georgia's economy did begin to improve. Now, how do we get to that 14%? I think it's important to tell folks of that too. Really, it's teamwork. We couldn't have reached that decision or reach where we got to without working really, really closely with the House Budget Office and also working with OPB. Chairman England and Kelly Farr were great partners in figuring out where we were at that point in time. Again, in a time when numbers are coming from everywhere and sometimes they're conflicting each other. We reached the 14% after trying to just amalgate a bunch of different figures. And the one that seemed to speak the loudest to us was Moody's figure that showed at that point in time, if Georgia entered a serious recession, we were looking at about a 15% reduction. If we're in a moderate recession, then we'd probably have about 11%. So we kind of split those numbers and went a little bit further to err on the side of caution and went at a 14% reduction at that time. As Georgia's economy reopened, you saw the governor was able to come in early June and say, y'all might need to look and figure on an 11% reduction instead. Again, Georgia's economy was reopening. People were getting back out shopping, building homes. We even saw an uptick in some car sales for the first time in months. So that allowed us as a legislature, I referred to earlier as something that was maybe, I wish we could say that we were smart enough to have thought of this ourselves, but it was just divine intervention. And we were able to sort of pick and choose off of the menu that the agencies had already offered of a 14% reduction. So they told us what it would take to get to 14. We knew we were only going to have to get to 11. We didn't have to take everything they offered up to cut. And the legislature peered through those lists, did that pretty well, and then again had a little bit more of good news come in right there at the very end in conference committee when the governor decided to pull out about $250 million from the RSR, the Rainy Day Reserve Fund, and $50 million from the Tobacco Settlement Fund to, again, cushion just a little bit more some of the human service cuts that we had to make previously. So where does that leave us now? We went from thinking we were going to have to cut from about $3 billion to cutting right at $2 billion. Our general fund's looking like it's right at $22 billion-ish. And so far, we're okay. We're watching some revenue numbers that are interesting. And I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say about this. The one that is just the most striking to me and that I keep looking at time and time again is the amount of state income tax that we are pulling in off of unemployment. So typically, as your listeners may know already, if you draw state unemployment, you do pay state income tax at our 5.75% rate right now. And we withhold that. State Department of Labor pays in a withholding of roughly between 1 and 3, sometimes as high as $4 million a month. But that really was as high as we've ever really seen it. Right now, we're seeing it come in at a much higher rate of like 120 to 135 million a month. Again, that's because of a couple of figures. There's a lot of more people on unemployment. Also, the $600 federal supplement. That's a lot higher than we're usually seeing income tax being levied at on an amount. So as that rolls off and ends technically on the 25th, but now it'll extend a few months because Georgia has about a 21-day delay in unemployment anyway. Looking to see what that's going to do for the future. I'm concerned that may have artificially held up our revenues a little bit where things may not have looked quite as bad as they really were. If that's the case, then September and October will be very telling. If we're wrong, or if the feds do extend, as you heard Congressman Graves talk about, extend some type of unemployment further, then we're probably in pretty good shape. Another figure to look at is the July 15th filings, and those are coming in. We're still seeing numbers that are coming in now. Haven't quite closed out the end of the year 2020, although normally it would be closed. Obviously, if you have a filing date that's July 15th for your taxes, you can't close it out on June 30th of 2020. And seeing what those numbers come in at. As senators asked me, I told them if it's less than 300 million, then I'm going to be very nervous. If it's 400 to 600, I'll feel okay. If it's over 600, I'm going to feel really good. And just early numbers lend us to think that we're going to be really close, if not over that $600 million figure. All that being said, though, remember, these were taxes paid on the best year ever of our economy. So even knowing that, we know that next year's revenues at best are flat and are likely lower than what we passed in our 2021 budget. So that hopefully gives you a good 25,000 foot view to sort of start this conversation. And again, thank you for allowing me to be present here today.
Well, thank you for that, Chairman Tillery. And then, so we, Ben, I'm going to pivot to you here. Of course, K-12 funding is the largest portion of the state budget. And, what do you expect are some of the trends we will see moving forward in the way that affects the state budget, both in terms of the federal funding that the state has already received and, the potential approach that Congressman Graves mentioned earlier, and just what are some of the implications on the state budget in terms of K-12 funding from your perspective?
Hey, thanks, Chris. First, let me say it's always an honor to speak at the oldest and most venerable think tank in Georgia, the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. And I want to thank the good congressman and Chairman Tillery for their great public service. K-12 education is about 40% of the Georgia state budget. And so when state revenues are hurt, it's obviously gonna hurt K-12 education funding. I wrote a piece in the Washington Examiner last week where I said the federal bailout of state and local governments should not happen right now. We should wait a year because states have reserves. Chairman Tillery did a great job of looking up reserves of public school districts in Georgia, and it's also true nationally. They have reserves. I think we should use those first. And then, because the federal government, as the congressman said, is shoveling money out the door by the trillions, And maybe we won't need it in a year because maybe we'll have a vaccine and things will turn around. That said, politics is politics, and there is going to be federal funding for state and local governments, including school districts. So I see that coming, but I do think that there's going to be a period of years where after the federal bailouts, state and local governments, including school districts, are going to have to be cautious with their spending.
And so, Ben, we spoke last week, we had an education panel, and, as we talked about some of the different ways in which education will evolve in the upcoming school year, would you mind just speaking a little bit on, what are the potential budget implications if you have school, physical locations that are not open? They're obviously not expanding electricity or using water. Just what are, from your perspective, what are some of the budget implications of that?
Yeah, let's say a school district, for sake of argument, is going to be fully online to start the year. I don't think the budget savings are going to be as big as a lot of people think. They're going to save money on things like transportation. They're going to save money on utilities and what have you. But they are going to have increased costs for like technology to students. A lot of school districts are doing a good job of getting Chromebooks and internet connections for students who don't have those sorts of things. Another cost is they are continuing their food service, but then they're having more transportation costs to get that food to the kids. Because a lot of low-income students, that's maybe the best food they get during the school year is what they get from school. And so I think a lot of school districts here in Georgia did a really good job of getting that food to students in need. So there might be some higher costs there. The budget savings of school districts aren't going to be big, but there's one cost I think that's coming that I don't think people have thought about. When the Great Recession came, private school enrollments nationally went down by 11%. In the history of private school enrollment in this country is whenever there's a recession, private school enrollment ratchets down and then it doesn't recover. Then there's another recession, it ratchets down again and ratchets down again. So private school enrollments today are still less than they were in percentage terms than they were in 2007. So we're going to see that again. Private school enrollments are going to ratchet down because a lot of people have lost their job or suffered pay cuts and what have you. And so that's a budget hit to the state in terms of formula funding for public schools, and it's going to be a budget hit to local school districts. So I think that's a cost I think some people aren't thinking about.
And so Ben, one more thing, and then I see that I'm glad to see that Amy's been able to join us. And I'm gonna bring her in here in a second. But so Ben, just Congressman Graves mentioned as well that this may be an opportunity to explore school choice, for parents. And so, from that perspective, I would say that school choice is often portrayed as being a net negative. It harms public school budgets. So would you mind just weighing in on that and what you see from when it comes to that?
I'll make 2 points there. Normally, I'm against federal programs for school choice. I think the federal government needs to stay out of that. But desperate times called for desperate measures. And states like South Carolina and Oklahoma used a portion of the governor's discretionary CARES Act funding, which was the previous federal bailout. Like, for example, South Carolina, I believe, is giving $5,000 scholarships to 6,000 students to attend private schools, again, to try to stop that enrollment loss in private schools and preventing a budget hit on the other end. So I would support something like that, using temporary money, federal money, to save the state money and school districts money later, with some kind of a scholarship program with federal money. So I support that. But I do think states, I've always thought school choice was a good idea. It is a good idea for lots of reasons. It makes the students who choose get a better education, the students who remain in public schools get a better education, and it saves taxpayers money, to get to your question. And I'll make it, I can nerd it up with budget staff if I have to, but I'll make it real simple. Public schools in Georgia a year ago spent $12,800 per student. $12,800 per student a year ago. That's federal, state, and local money. Right? The state portion of that was about $5,700 a student. The average tax credit scholarship per student, including administrative costs. Georgia has that $100 million tax credit scholarship program. And so people like to say, oh, $100 million going to private schools in this tax credit scholarship program. Well, public schools spend about $22 billion. So $100 million is rounding error, right? But those scholarships cost the taxpayer about $3,700 per student. So you're giving a child a $3,700 scholarship to go to a private school. But if they'd gone to a public school, it would have cost the state about $5,700, so $2,000 more. And all in, it would have cost $12,800 a student. So why are we taking the one that's the smallest cost and saying, oh, that's the budget problem, and we're ignoring the bigger ones? So from a fiscal standpoint, I think states should consider school choice programs now more than ever. But from an educational standpoint, I think it would make our state a more educated place.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Ben. And just given the prevalence of K-12 funding in the state budget, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up circling back to discuss that before everything is said and done. But I do want to bring Amy in now. And Amy, I had mentioned your bio briefly earlier, but you bring a very unique perspective. Prior to joining the John Locke Foundation, you had spent many years in Colorado, and Colorado state budget writers have this have a little item called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR in policy speak. So would you mind just sharing your perspective on what you've seen in budget writing in good times and bad when TABOR is in play?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thanks for your patience, and I eventually got here, and many thanks to Kennedy for helping work to eventually get us connected. So I appreciate that. Because I spent 16 years in public policy in Colorado, and at the state-based think tank there, which is the Independence Institute, and also my husband is still a state senator there. So he is the assistant minority leader in the state Senate. So I've lived under Tabor. I've heard about it from the legislative side. I have heard about it from, from public policy side. And here's the thing. The Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, Colorado's in particular, that Taxpayers' Bill of Rights has saved the state numerous times, despite some lawmakers' good but misguided intentions to overspend. Because what happens, like when COVID hit, Colorado was, despite progressive left control, Colorado was still in a better place than other states that have a similar sort of what I would call ideological makeup, like California, Illinois, New York, because the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights limits government spending to inflation plus population. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the state can't raise taxes, because it can. It just has to make a case to voters. The other thing, legislators have figured out how to raise fees, and they call darn near everything a fee now. So they raise revenue that way. Still, that being said, it has put more money in the pockets of Coloradans. And what we have found is that Coloradans don't just like the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, they love it. I mean, in a way that if you're a lawmaker, you should have it stamped on your forehead, I support the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Because when you give them what the simple definition is of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, likely voter support for Tabor among likely voters goes to over 70%. In fact, 73% is what we found. Another poll found it at 72%. Coloradans, voters, want to have a say in the size and scope of government that they are willing to pay for. And it has saved the state. Back in the Great Recession, Colorado wasn't in near the shape that some other states found themselves in. And then when you fast forward to the situation that Colorado found and other states found themselves in, they were in a much better position to weather the storm. North Carolina doesn't have a taxpayer's Bill of Rights in statute, but it has legislators that have voluntarily, now wrap your minds around this, legislators that have voluntarily budgeted to rate of inflation plus population. Well, what did that mean? Well, it meant that they had over $3 billion in reserves. When I say reserves, I mean they had a reserve fund. They also had, because of a veto from the governor, there was unallocated money. And then the unemployment trust fund was, not only had they fully paid back the feds for all the borrowing they did during the Great Recession, but they had a sizable amount in the unemployment trust fund, that fund there. And because of that fiscal responsibility, whether it's in Colorado, where they're trying, where voters have told lawmakers, listen, this is what you get. This is what we want you doing. If you want more, you have to come to us and ask. Or in North Carolina, where lawmakers did it voluntarily, it set up states to weather this storm much, much better than other states. You know, other states like California and Illinois and New York that have been notoriously irresponsible with taxpayer dollars.
And thank you for that perspective, Amy. And then, with your return to North Carolina, what are just some of the stresses and that you've seen on the state budget? What are some of the priorities that you've seen in North Carolina? And then are there, any innovations that you would like to share with us today?
Oh, great question. And I will compare and contrast my two states. So Colorado, one of the things that those who like to spend more than they take in passed without asking voters was Medicaid expansion. And what they didn't do was tell voters, oh yeah, by the way, it's going to crowd out everything else in the budget. So we're going to raise taxes later. So they were less than honest with how they were going to pay for Medicaid expansion. So as a result of that, you have 1 in 4 Coloradans in one of the healthiest states in the country, 1 in 4 Coloradans on Medicaid, predominantly, adult men without children of working age. And what it's done is crowded out K-12, and it's crowded out higher ed for sure, and roads. Road funding for infrastructure is pretty much flatlined over almost a decade, and that's what happens when you expand Medicaid without paying for it. So Colorado is going through that. Now you go to North Carolina, which has budgeted responsibly. They did not expand Medicaid because guess what? Medicaid expansion isn't free, despite what people will tell you, it isn't free. And instead, what we have encouraged, and actually what we saw was, especially COVID, if there's a silver lining in any of this, it is policy innovation. And we have a very strict certificate of need law here in North Carolina. One of the things that we suggested, and the governor did, and it was supported by the state legislature, was eliminate the certificate of need law for number of beds. Well, that makes total sense because we didn't know how quickly we would get COVID cases that could easily, stress out the healthcare system. So there was that. Also, telemedicine which being able to have access to telemedicine and have access to it across state lines as well. So we've seen a rapid growth in telemedicine. You know, I just tried to make an appointment. I was making an appointment to see the doctor and actually got an offer. It was, hey, would you like to have a virtual visit? No copay. So those kinds of things have come out of this, you know, out of COVID. I'll tell you the other thing we have seen is because of, you all were talking about K-12. Well, North Carolina has one of the highest percentages of students in the nation in homeschool, 149,000, and we expect that to go up much higher this year. Well, once the governor, July 1st, he was supposed to make his announcement on which plan it was going to be. Was it going to be all virtual? Was it going to be in person, or was it going to be some kind of a hybrid? He's supposed to do that on July 1. When he punted on it and said, yeah, don't quite have it yet. The number of people who went to the homeschool website, the site, the state website that essentially, you know, says, yeah, you can homeschool, it crashed, and it crashed for over a week. The interest in homeschooling has gone up exponentially in the state. And we also have opportunity scholarships here. So you're talking about South Carolina. So in North Carolina, we have, I think it's, it's either 12, it might be, you know, it's over 12,000, could be upwards of 15,000, predominantly minority and low income students that get a $4,700 opportunity scholarship to attend a school that best fits their needs. So we have school choice options. We also have ESAs as well. We have school choice options. And what is interesting is that the teachers, it's an association here. The Teachers Association recently filed a lawsuit. When I say recently, I mean yesterday, filed a lawsuit to stop the Opportunity Scholarship program for particular schools, which is unfortunate because, as we were alluding to, you know, $4,700 is a lot less expensive than what it is per capita to educate a student in a traditional government K-12 school. $4,700 is less expensive. So you know, you give that student $4,700. Their parent is probably chipping in another X amount of dollars to educate that student. And now what we have is an association that is trying to stop those children from getting the education that best suits them. So there's been lots of innovation in North Carolina with medicine, with K-12, things that we have recommended that the legislature has you know, certainly been a partner with us on some of that. This is really a time when you look at some of the regulations that have been in place prior to COVID and you go, yet never needed those in the first place. So if there's any silver lining in any of this, it is the policy innovation that is coming out.
No, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that with us, Amy. And Chairman Tillery, I actually wanted to pivot back to you and just see if there were any you know, policy innovations in Georgia you would like to spotlight. And then looking at the time here, I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A from our audience, but I also feel like it'd be great as well. You know, prior to joining the General Assembly, you were a county commission chairman in Toombs County. So you know what it's like to, you know, see the flowing of funds to and from the state government. So if you share a little bit about your perspective on that as well, please.
Good timing with the pivot to the local governments. You'll see today that OPB and the governor's office rolled out what's going to happen with the CARES funds that are coming to the local level. You know, the state of Georgia got roughly $4 billion. $2 billion of those are for local governments. and how they're spending that out. So if you're involved with a local government, represent one, or going to lunch with somebody who's in one, make sure they go by OPV's website today and apply for those funds, and also see how the state tried to balance flexibility with also our requirement to certify that those funds are used on COVID resources. Because if they aren't, and we give them out to those local governments, then we're stuck holding the bag and holding the bill to pay back the federal government afterwards. So good pivot there, Chris. Appreciate that opportunity to plug that. Innovation, I think we're doing some creative things by watching just who's coming in and who's not. Key swipes. I was meeting with some DCS employees this morning and talking with them about how much more productive they're being, and then when the last time they went to the office was. So I think you'll see a reduction in footprint space just for buildings that will probably allow us to move into our own buildings. You may see that could cause some issues with folks who've had leases over a period of time. I don't know that we won't, I don't see us not honoring any bond payments or leases that we already have, but we may not be in a position to need to renew those going forward. You'll see a leaner, tighter, more efficient government. Think about windshield time just in rural Georgia. If you're going to visit foster families and you start in Nahana, and then you've got to go to your office that happens to be in Brunswick, and then you're headed back out to, could be Berrien County, Nashville, probably not that far, but it could easily be Little Lissy. You're spending a whole lot more time driving than you are talking. And the way that technology has improved such a way to allow that these cameras that we are all speaking on right now to sort of pan and scan the room and make sure that somebody's not on the other side of this camera telling me exactly what to say right now for a testing environment. It works the same way when you're using community service to view someone who's on state probation or other types of supervision models that we need. That's sort of scary and creepy in one sphere, and at the other side, it's a huge cost saving. So I think you'll see less windshield time and more use of virtual spaces, potentially less buildings. Remember, our drivers in state government are buildings, people, education, and health. Those are our big drivers. And anything we can do to save in one allows us to spend more in another. I appreciate the leadership of the folks who came before me. And y'all know I've talked about him a lot, but specifically Chairman Hill, and how he really did hold Georgia's budget in line during very difficult times. And then as things began to grow, you did not see Georgia's growth in its budget pace its growth in population. I think we're projected for another 17 or 18% growth in the next 9 years. I would be shocked if you see our budget grow by 17 or 18%. That'd be what, $4 or $5 billion more dollars. I'd be shocked if we grow by that much then. Don't never say never, but I don't think it will happen as long as I'm chairman. So the moving forward from there, I think Georgia's got some innovative times, just like the rest of our country does, as we embrace technology and see, are we building nearly as much brick and mortar in the future?
And while I have you queued up here, I'm going to go ahead and incorporate one question we received from the audience, and that is, what is the fastest growing item in the budget currently due to the coronavirus?
Well, due to coronavirus or just due overall, then probably the answer is the same. It's health. Health and education are our two drivers. If you take those two items together and add them up, it's 77% of your budget. We spend roughly 38% of our budget in education. Ben mentioned that earlier, in K-12. We spend another 10-ish in Regents. And then we spend another probably 2 to 3 in TCSG, 1 and early childhood, early care and learning. So you add that up, you're about at 54-ish. You throw on top of that another 23% with community health. When we walk in the door, 3/4 of the pie is already at it.
No, absolutely. And Ben, did you have some thoughts on that as well?
Some thoughts on what's your specific question? Sorry.
I thought I saw you over there nodding, and maybe you're just nodding in agreement, just so enthusiastically.
I was just nodding in agreement. Yes.
Saying, yeah.
I mean, every governor is the Medicaid governor, right? They want to be the education governor,
Yes.
but then if you look at the budget, they're the Medicaid governor.
And I mean, just overall, just based on what you've seen, just any thoughts on that?
I think I think the budget's going to be tight for a few years, just like it was at the end of the Great Recession. That lasted for a period of years. And I agree with the chairman about the budget growth. If population grows 18% over the next 9 years, the budget's going to grow at a slower rate. That's how it's going to be.
And I tell you what, I'm trying to incorporate these questions. So if y'all have them for our panelists, please send them in. And Amy, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I wondered, there was a comment about flexibility in the funding from the CARES Act. And I just wanted to comment on that. John Locke Foundation, along with the Platt Institute, co-authored a letter that was sent to Congress asking for flexibility in the original CARES Act money. So whatever it is that Georgia received, I think North Carolina got roughly $4 billion, maybe a little bit more, $4 billion, asking for flexibility in how that money is allocated and spent. One of the things that we found was, if you look back to the Great Recession and the Stimulus Act, the way that was written, it almost compelled states to create new programs to spend money on. I mean, in Colorado, the notorious Colorado Energy Office, this office that was roughly anywhere from $6 to $15 million at the most, $1 million or entity, became $150 million overnight. And they were literally just throwing money out the door, trying to figure out how to spend it all, as opposed to spending it wisely in a way that the state and local governments really, really need. So Georgia Public Policy, Georgia Policy signed on part of that letter, and we just got word that that flexibility is likely, it is included right now in the Senate version, that there will be some flexibility on how state and local governments can use that. Of course, now it's up to elected officials to use it wisely. So we have to trust our elected officials that they will do that. But the good news is there will be some, hopefully there will be some flexibility there, and it is in the Senate version. And then a real quick, I want to give a shout out to my friends in Georgia. I was there last weekend, had the best peaches on planet Earth. You all have great, great peaches. My brother lives just outside of Macon, and it was lovely, hot and steamy, but thank you for the hospitality from the folks who live in Georgia.
Well, Amy, as payment for those wonderful peaches you enjoyed, what advice would you give our elected officials here in Georgia, just based on what you've seen?
Well, one of the things I encourage this. We do it here in North Carolina, same thing in Colorado, and I'm sure you all are doing it. It is the expansion of telehealth. Expand capacity rather than locking people into and I'm not suggesting you all are doing it, they're trying to do it here in North Carolina, rather than locking people all into, everybody into a sort of a government dictated scheme, expanding healthcare capacity through telehealth, through telemedicine. Licensing reform has been huge as well. We found out recently, you have to spend more time to be more hours in the classroom to be a barber in North Carolina than it is to be darn near anything else. I mean, wrap your mind around that. Some poor guy just wants to cut his neighbor's hair and set up shop, and he can't do it because he's got to spend 1,500 hours in training, whereas law enforcement doesn't even have that much. So licensing reform, which I think you guys have been all over as well, and then what you all have been talking about which is the responsible budgeting. Certainly when the good times come, which doesn't mean it's going to help for now, but there's always another event down the road. There's always another recession. There's always some black swan event. This admittedly is like a two-headed mutant black swan, but there's always another event, and responsible budgeting in good times pays off in the long run, just like it does for our families. So those would be some of the things that I would recommend, that we're talking about in North Carolina, and I'm sure you all are talking about in Georgia as well.
Absolutely, and we have great fiscally conservative stewards as our budget writers. So, you know, Chairman Tillery, Chairman England, staff at OPB, they're, you know, House Budget Office staff, Senate Budget Office staff. Thank you for the work that y'all do. And Ben, I'm going to shoot this next question over to you. There is a national conversation about whether budget decisions should incentivize in-person schooling. Is the state conversation considering anything similar to try to influence decision-making in local school districts for the fall?
I think the decision on in-person schooling should be made at the local level. But I think it should be more local than it is now by letting parents take their tax money devoted to their child's education and move it to a private or charter school if they don't like the decision that their school district is making. So I support local control, not only at the school district level, but down to the parent level. That said, if I was in the US Congress, I would support tying federal funds to if you open or don't open, because there's a cost difference there. But I wouldn't be doing it to incentivize any decisions. I would just be recognizing that cost structures are different.
Ben, do you mind expanding just briefly on that formula and why those incentives are different in terms of federal and state funding?
What I was trying to say is that you know, the federal government, it looks like, is going to give a slug of funds earmarked for K-12 education. Let's say you're a public school that's going to be, a district's going to be fully online. You're going to get this federal money that you don't need because your district has reserves, your state has reserves. And since 1950, I've written this for Ed Choice a bunch of times. If you Google Scafidi Ed Choice staffing surge, you can find it. Public school staffing has skyrocketed in this country, far in excess what we need to accommodate enrollment growth. And then teacher salaries for about 25 years have been stagnant. So they keep getting more money for public schools. They just keep adding bodies more than they need. And they hold teacher salaries constant. Now, some of that goes to benefits costs, of course. It's also gone to what I call the staffing surge. And so if the federal government just writes another check and schools stay closed, it's just funding another staffing surge on top of what we've been doing since 1950.
While I have you unmuted here, do you have any thoughts on whether or not Georgia schools should get involved with teaching preventative medicine to kids that might help alleviate costs to the state? That was a question from the audience.
You know, everybody has, the public schools should do this, the public schools should do that, right? And so we keep expanding what they need to do. I think in health classes, you know, my kids are in public school, they did get some of that. Actually, they got quite a bit of that. I'm sure that varies by school system and probably varies by teacher on how much of that. So I would not be in favor of more mandates on public schools, no matter how well-intentioned. Again, if you let parents control the money, they'll choose schools that teach what they think, you know, schools should be teaching.
Absolutely. And so as we're approaching the end of the panel here, I have received, in case anyone has any other questions, go ahead and send them in the Q&A panel. But, actually, here we go. Just got one come in. So regarding the effects of private school closures and declines in enrollment, are the incentives different with public schools closed and working parents considering hiring a tutor or babysitter instead?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of parents are considering private schools if they can afford it, because private schools have been very proactive about doing social distancing and other health measures in the school, because their incentives are to stay open because a lot of parents want that. And private schools tend to be a lot smaller, and they tend to just be one school. So they're not dealing with all these bureaucracies telling them what to do. so they can be more flexible, and they're smaller, so they can make more accommodations. So absolutely, a lot of parents are doing that. And again, if parents controlled the money, there would be more hiring private tutors. Eric Warren and I wrote this back in April. We called it quarantine circles. You know, families could get together, and now they're calling them pods and other things, learning pods and what have you. But yeah, I think more parents would do that sort of thing.
And Amy, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, just anecdotally, I can't tell you the number of parents that have told me first of all, their kids need in-person teaching, that all day virtual learning just doesn't work for either their family or for their student, for their child. So the number of parents that have said, listen, I can't get into a private school because, by the way, they don't have any room, or charter schools are now capped and there's a huge waiting list. But they have talked about these homeschool, they call them micro pods, whatever. We call them homeschool co-ops. So the number of families that are getting together and doing that, and then looking to hire retired teachers who are willing to teach, but also parents then who say, my expertise is this, and I'll teach these, 10 students at the most, maybe these 5 students on this day, and I'll teach them, what economics, or I'll teach them history, or whatever that is. And the interest in homeschooling in North Carolina, like I said, it broke the website, not just for an hour or two, but it was almost a week the site was down. People have so much interest because some of our largest school districts have gone to this all virtual and learning, and it doesn't work, especially for parents who need to get back to work. We had an article yesterday, or it may have been the day before, on Carolina Journal that said parents with this all virtual are being forced to choose between their job and their child's education. So what do? They, whatever they have to do, they're innovating on their own, pulling people together, neighbors together, and coming up with their own mini co-op or whatever that homeschool is. I think you're going to see a very quick rise in that. And I don't know if you're going to, to the point about private schools, this might be their moment. Who knows what they come back like? But if money follows the child, if money funds the student and not the system, I think we'll see all kinds of innovation in K-12.
All right, and I have one last question because we are approaching the end of our program today. And Ben, it's actually a follow-up to a question that you had answered earlier. And then after you give your thoughts, I'm going to throw it over to Chairman Tillery. He can tell us the fiscal reality of the answer to this question. But there is currently no mechanism in place that would allow parents to use education resources to make choices when they don't like this choice that their school district is making. And so is there a policy solution on the horizon that would allow parents to control their education dollars, as you suggested earlier? And, is an ESA the answer in that case?
Yeah, we actually have 3 small programs in Georgia. One is the special needs scholarship for students, who have a special need. They can take a scholarship, just their state funds, and use that to go to private school. But that is dramatically less funding per student than they would get in the public school. We also have that $100 million tax credit scholarship program, which is rounding error in the scheme of things. And that is allowing, I think it's 14,000 students to exercise choice that way, and their families exercise choice. And then we have charter schools in Georgia that's allowing some choice in the public system. Yeah, something like an ESA, something like increasing the cap on donations to the tax credit scholarship program. Those would allow more people to control their funding. And like Amy said, it would allow for dramatically more innovation, not only in education, but also in health and safety, given this difficult time.
Right, and then Chairman Tillery, any thoughts on that as we close out the Q&A session?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ben, for pointing out what Georgia already does on special needs and also on the gold scholarships, et cetera. Charter schools, hey, listen, we're spending a ton of money over there. Our charter supplement alone will be more than T&E if we can continue at the current pace. So I think Georgia is doing a lot of things on an innovative front concerning education. The other thing is to remember that in Georgia, dollars do follow students by FTE. That's how we fund students. So if these students decide, the parents decide that they're going to take them a homeschooling route, or if they're going to take them to a private schooling route, now the dollars may not follow them to the private school or to the home school, but that would be a reduction of funds in the public school, and the public school is going to have to adapt to that. So I think to look right now and say that the world in 2023 is going to look the same as it looked in 2019, none of us think that. None of us at all think that. We all believe it's going to be differently. I was somebody in 2018 saying, hey, I think it's just a matter of time until we're schooling via laptop and you're picking your a la carte menu of classes, the same way that I studied for the bar exam in 2008 or 2009. And folks kind of laughed at me a little bit, and I said, you know, it's probably 2030 before that happens. No, not now. Everything that we thought was in 2030 got accelerated by at least 5 years. And as we see, and maybe faster, and as we see that continue, it's going to change more things in our economy. In my neck of the woods down here in South Georgia, the kid that wanted to go hunting from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, he's going to be able to do that, walk in at 9 o'clock and start taking his algebra class. The person who wanted to work a job that said, look, we can't work with your work study program. We can't just take you 2 hours a day. We need you 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day or 4 hours a day. They're going to be able to structure those classes accordingly. Now, we do have an issue in that, and that's how we currently have resources and who has the ability to have those resources. So our schools, my prediction is they become smaller. They don't become public libraries, but they become more like public libraries where folks are having space that they can get individualized attention, where they're able to take studying if they're not able, or maybe mandatory tutoring. If they're not able to get their class courses on schedule, they're not keeping up to that, to what the guy who wanted to go hunting at 6 a.m. decided to walk in at 9 a.m. and do. And all of that we thought was 2030 plus is now 2024, 2025, 2026. How do we provide the resources for that student who lives less than a mile from where I'm sitting right now, who doesn't have the internet access to do that at 9 a.m. from his coffee table? Well, that's a good question. It's a really good question, which is again why I think our schools and our bonding package for education in the future probably looks a lot different.
And I think those were great words to end on. And Chairman Tillery, I want to thank you for your time today. Ben, Amy, I want to thank you for your time as well. Really enjoyed it. I really feel like our audience got a lot out of it today. And with that, I'm going to concede control of the panel over to Kyle.
Thanks very much. And thank you to each of you as a panelist. That was a great discussion, a lot to think about in terms of, you know, how is that future being accelerated due to the circumstances around us, and how do we adapt to that? So exactly what we wanted to talk about, and thanks to each of you for that. One more thanks to our sponsors as well, our presenting sponsor AT&T, our platinum sponsors Verizon and the Walton Family Foundation, and our silver sponsor, the Georgia Association of Realtors. We will be back next Tuesday at 11 a.m. to talk about land use and transportation, how everything from commercial real estate to roads and rails may be affected by telecommuting and social distancing and other changes brought about by the pandemic. So we hope you will join us for that next Tuesday, August 4th. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.